One single day in October, in the year 1066, completely changed the English language, the English people, and the entire way England worked, forever. And the people of England never saw it coming. What you are about to hear is the story of three men who all believed they had the right to sit on the throne of England. Three men so determined, so hungry for power, that they were willing to go to war, cross oceans, march armies through freezing mud, and spill rivers of blood just to wear a crown. This is the story of the Norman Conquest, the story of the Battle of Hastings, the story of how England, as we know it today, was born in fire on a hill in October, over 950 years ago. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why 1066 is the single most important year in English history, and why what happened on that 1 October morning is still shaping your language, your country, and your everyday life right now. Stay with me, because what comes next is going to completely change the way you think about the world you live in. To really understand why 1066 exploded into one of the most violent and world-changing years in English history, you have to step back. You have to understand what England looked like before all the chaos started, because the seeds of the Battle of Hastings were planted long before 1066. They were planted in the way England was ruled, in the way power worked, and in the complicated, messy life of one very particular king. In the early 1000s, England was not the country we recognize today. It was a kingdom that had been through storms of invasions, wars, and power shifts for hundreds of years before that single October morning. The people running England were the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples who had moved over from what is now Germany and Denmark centuries earlier, long before anyone had ever heard of William of Normandy or the Norman Conquest. They had built their own culture, their own spoken and written language called Old English, their own laws, their own customs, and their own way of organizing society. England in those days was divided into large regions called earldoms. Think of them like enormous counties, but each one controlled by a nobleman called an earl who had enormous power. These earls were not just local administrators. They were hugely powerful people who commanded armies, collected taxes, made legal decisions, and in many ways ran their slice of England like their own personal kingdom. There were several major earldoms: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the middle, East Anglia in the east, and the most powerful of all, Wessex in the south. And the family that controlled Wessex was the Godwins. Now, the actual king of England at this time was a man named Edward. History calls him Edward the Confessor, a title that tells you almost everything about the kind of person he was. He was a deeply religious man, someone who genuinely cared more about the church, about prayer, and about God than he did about battles, politics, and power games. He built Westminster Abbey in London, which still stands today, and it was one of the great achievements of his reign. He was, in many ways, a thoughtful and reasonable ruler. But he had one problem that was bigger than all his strengths put together. He had no children. In the Middle Ages, this was not just a personal sadness. It was a political time bomb. Kings passed their thrones to their sons. That was the system. No son meant no clear person to take over. And Edward, who had spent much of his younger years in exile in Normandy, in what is today northern France, had come back to England and brought with him a lot of Norman friends, advisors, and churchmen. He had essentially imported a circle of Norman influence right into the heart of the English court. The English nobility absolutely hated this. They did not want these Norman outsiders coming in, taking important positions, and getting the king's ear. The tension between the English-born nobles and the Normans Edward kept favoring became a serious problem. The most powerful English earl of all, the man who ran Wessex, was a man named Godwin, and Godwin clashed with Edward more than once over this Norman influence. Then Godwin died in 1053, and his son stepped into his shoes. That son was Harold Godwinson, and Harold was everything his father had been, and more. He was tall, physically strong, experienced in battle, respected by other nobles, politically smart, and deeply connected to England and its people. As Edward grew older and increasingly ill, Harold essentially became the man who actually ran the country. He was the second most powerful person in England in title, but in practice, many people would say he was already the first. So England in 1065 was a country with a very sick, very old king. Edward would die in early January 1066. no clear air, and a power vacuum that was going to attract every ambitious person in Europe like moths to a flame. And then Edward died. He died on the 5th of January, 1066. And the moment he did, the most dangerous game of power politics in English history began. When a medieval king died without a clear heir, things fell apart fast. And the falling apart 1066 happened at a truly staggering speed. The moment Edward died, the question of who should be king became the most urgent and the most dangerous question on the continent of Europe. There were multiple men who believed, or at least claimed to believe, that they had the right to sit on England's throne. And in medieval politics, a claim to a throne was worth nothing at all if you could not defend it with soldiers, swords, and the stomach for violence. The people who officially decided who became king were called the Witan or the Witnagemot. This was essentially a council of England's most important and powerful men, the great earls, the senior bishops, the leading nobles. They had to recognize authority to approve and confirm a new king, and they made their decision with extraordinary speed. On the 6th of January, 1066, the very day after, or possibly even the same day as Edward's death, the Witan chose Harold Godwinson as King of England. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey, possibly still warm from Edward's funeral. The ceremony was rushed. The timing was almost suspicious in its speed. It was clearly meant to present the world with a done deal before anyone else could make a move. But two men, sitting in two very different places, with two very different armies, were already making moves. Harold Godwinson had, on the surface, the strongest claim. He was English. He was experienced. He had been running England for years. His family was the most powerful in the country, so powerful that his own sister Edith was Edward's queen. He had the backing of the Witan. He had the backing of the church in England. He had been named, or so his supporters said, by Edward himself on his deathbed. That Edward had pointed at Harold and essentially said, "This man." Harold was a proven leader. He had fought battles. He had governed land. He knew how England worked. And he had enormous personal popularity among the English people. But there was a complication, a serious one. A year or two before Edward's death, the exact year is debated, somewhere around 1063 to 1065, Harold had sailed to Normandy. The reason for this voyage is itself a mystery that historians have argued over for centuries. Some say a storm blew his ship off course accidentally. Some say Edward sent him on a diplomatic mission. Some say Harold went voluntarily. Whatever the reason, he ended up in the hands of William, the Duke of Normandy. William was dangerous and very clever, and he saw in Harold's presence an opportunity. He made Harold swear an oath. Not just any oath, but an oath on holy relics, the bones of saints. In the medieval Catholic world, swearing on holy relics was the most serious, the most binding, and the most terrifying kind of promise you could make. Breaking such an oath was not just a political act. It was a sin. It was an offense against God. Harold swore to support William's claim to the English throne when Edward died. Then Harold went back to England. Edward died, and Harold took the crown. When William heard the news, he did not just feel politically betrayed. He believed Harold had committed a sin against God, and that belief, or the very convenient use of that belief, would become one of William's most powerful weapons in the months ahead. William, Duke of Normandy, was arguably one of the most formidable people in all of Europe at that point in history. And he had a backstory so dramatic, it almost sounds made up. He was born around 1028, and his birth was already a source of conflict. He was illegitimate, meaning his father, Robert I, Duke of Normandy, was not married to his mother. His mother, Herleva, was the daughter of a tanner, someone who prepared animal hides into leather. This was not a high-status profession, and William carried the insult of his birth throughout his entire life. People called him William the Bastard, and the people who called him that were not being friendly. But rather than being crushed by the mockery and the difficulty of the position, William turned it into fuel. He had to fight for absolutely everything he had. As a young child, he survived multiple assassination attempts from Norman nobles who wanted him dead or removed. As a teenager and young man, he fought off revolts from those same nobles. He formed alliances, crushed enemies, and by the time he was in his early 30s, He had turned Normandy into the most militarily powerful and well-organized state in Western Europe. William's claim to the English throne came through family connection and personal promise. His great-aunt Emma of Normandy had been married to two different English kings, Ethelred the Unready, and after Ethelred died, to the Viking King Canute. Through Emma, William could claim a Norman connection to the English royal line, though this link was fairly distant. More importantly, William claimed that Edward the Confessor had personally promised him the throne of England during a visit William made to the English court around 1051. He claimed Edward had looked at him and said, "When I die, the throne is yours." We have no clear written record of this promise. We cannot prove it happened, but William absolutely insisted it did, and in the political landscape at the time, it was at least plausible. Edward had grown up in Normandy, had Norman friends, and might genuinely have intended to pass the throne to his Norman relative. And then there was Harold's oath. Harold had sworn on holy relics to support William. When Harold broke that oath and grabbed the crown himself, William went straight to the Pope with his case. Pope Alexander II, after hearing William's arguments, and probably also seeing an opportunity to bring England more firmly under the Church's influence, sided with William. He gave William a papal banner, a physical symbol of God's blessing on the invasion. This was a weapon of enormous power. William could now tell every soldier who fought for him that they were fighting a war with God's approval. He could tell the world that Harold was not just a political rival. He was an oath breaker, a sinner, a man whose kingship had no true right behind it. William then began his preparation for invasion with the cold, careful efficiency that kept him alive since childhood. He summoned his Norman nobles and promised them land and titles in England in exchange for fighting with him. He reached out beyond Normandy. Soldiers and knights came from Brittany, Flanders, and other parts of France, all drawn by the promise of English land and wealth. He ordered the construction of hundreds of ships. He gathered horses, weapons, food, supplies. He even had sections of prefabricated wooden castles loaded onto ships so he could build fortifications the moment he landed in England. The scale of what William assembled was staggering for the time. Estimates of his fleet range from around 600 to over 700 ships. His army is estimated at somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 fighting men, including a significant force of heavily armed knights on horseback, which the English did not have in the same numbers. Then he waited at the Norman coast for favorable winds to cross the English Channel. The wind did not cooperate for weeks. The army sat and waited, eating supplies, growing restless. But William kept them together through sheer force of discipline and will. And now we meet the man that most people completely forget about when they tell the story of 1066. Most retellings go straight from Harold to William, as if those were the only two people involved. But there was a third man, a third claimant, who was just as dangerous, just as hungry for the throne, and who actually struck first. His name was Harald Hardrada. He was the king of Norway. His name, Hardrada, means hard ruler. He was, by virtually all accounts, the most feared warrior in all of Europe. He was reportedly enormous, over 6 feet tall at a time when the average man was much shorter. He had spent decades fighting everywhere from Norway to Russia to the Byzantine Empire in what is now Turkey, where he had served in the elite Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople. This man had seen and done things that would make a normal soldier's blood run cold. His claim to the English throne was based on an old political agreement from the time when the Viking King Canute had ruled over England, Norway, and Denmark. A deal had apparently been struck back, then, that Norway would have some right to England after Canute's line ended. This was, honestly, a very thin claim. Even people at the time thought it was a stretch. But when you have an army as formidable as Harald Hardrada's army, a thin claim becomes whatever you say it is. And Hardrada had an ally who knew England very well. Harold Godwinson, the new king of England, had a brother named Tostig, and Tostig despised Harold with a cold fury that only a betrayed family member can really manage. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria, the great northern earldom. He had been a brutal and deeply unpopular ruler, and the people of Northumbria had risen up against him in open revolt in 1065. Harold, instead of protecting his brother, had sided with the rebels. He removed Tostig from his position and sent him into exile. Tostig never forgave Harold for that. He spent the early months of 1066 trying to find allies. He tried William of Normandy. He tried the King of Denmark. He tried various other rulers. Most said no or gave him nothing useful. But Harald Hardrada said yes. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada sailed from Norway with a massive fleet. Reports suggest around 300 ships, carrying an army estimated at somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 men. He collected Tostig and his smaller force along the way. They moved into the north of England, sailing up the Humber estuary, and began devastating the region. On the 20th of September, 1066, Hardrada's army fought and defeated the English forces of Earls Edwin and Morcar at a place called Gate Fulford, just outside York. It was not a small skirmish. Edwin and Morcar had brought real armies, but Hardrada crushed them. Many English soldiers died or were captured. The city of York, the second greatest city in England, essentially surrendered. Hardrada was demanding hostages and supplies. He was acting like a man who had already won the north. Harold Godwinson, down in London, received the news like a punch to the face, and he had to decide what to do next. The months between January and September 1066 had already been brutal for Harold. He had barely sat down on the throne before problems started piling up. From January, he knew William was preparing an invasion from the south. Through the spring and summer, Tostig had been raiding the English coast with a small fleet, probing for weaknesses, causing panic, testing Harold's defenses. Harold had responded by gathering his housecarls, his personal professional soldiers, the elite of the English military, and calling up the FYRD, the part-time citizen militia. He had set up a watch along the southern coast, with ships patrolling the channel. The FYRD were free men, farmers, craftsmen, who were legally required to serve in the army when called upon. They were not professional soldiers, but they could fight, and in large numbers they were a real force. Harold had assembled as many as he could and stationed them along the south coast. Harold's housecarls were full-time professional soldiers, highly trained and well-armed, loyal to the king personally. The FYRD were part-time fighters, ordinary men called up for military service when the kingdom needed them. Harold also maintained a fleet of ships along the Channel coast throughout that summer. The defense was strong, but it could only last as long as the men could be kept away from their homes and farms. All summer, the English army watched the Channel, waiting for Norman sails. But William was waiting for wind. The weeks stretched into months. By early September, Harold's supply lines were strained. Keeping a large army in the field for months is expensive and logistically very difficult. The FYRD men had farms to tend, families to feed, harvest to bring in. In early September, Harold made the painful decision to stand his forces down. He sent the FYRD home. He moved his fleet to London for repairs. 3 days later, perhaps less, word came from the north. Hardrada had landed. Gate Fulford had been fought and lost. Harold's reaction was immediate and completely decisive. He was going north. Right now, what Harold did next is one of the most impressive military achievements in the entire medieval period. He gathered his housecarls and whatever other forces he had available and began marching north from London at a speed that was, by the standards of the time, almost unbelievable. From London to York is roughly 200 miles. Harold and his army covered this distance in approximately 4 to 5 days. That is a pace of around 40 miles a day, on foot and on horseback, over roads that were nothing like what we have today. It was a genuine feat of physical endurance and sheer determination. By the 24th of September, Harold's army had reached Tadcaster, just south of York. He had moved so fast that Hardrada and his army, camped at a place called Stamford Bridge about 8 miles east of York, had absolutely no idea he was coming. The 25th of September, 1066. A warm, clear morning. Hardrada's Vikings were relaxed. They were expecting the formal delivery of hostages from Yorkshire, the ceremonial submission of the local population. Many of the Vikings had left their heavy armor back at the ships, which were moored further away at a place called Rickcall. They were just waiting for the formalities to be completed. It was practically a day off. And then someone looked to the south and saw the glittering, shimmering cloud of an approaching army. There's a legendary story, possibly true, possibly a great tale that grew with each retelling, about what happened at the bridge crossing the River Derwent. Hardrada's men were on the far side of the river from Harold's approach. They needed to get across to form up their battle line. And one enormous Norwegian warrior apparently stood on that bridge and held off Harold's entire advancing army on his own. According to the story, he was wielding a massive battle axe and cut down man after man, as many as 40 men in some accounts, who tried to force their way across. He was eventually killed when an English soldier floated under the bridge in a wooden tub and stabbed him from below. True or legend, it captures something real about what followed. When the Vikings got across and organized themselves into a battle line, they fought with a ferocity that Scandinavian warriors were famous for across Europe. Hardrada himself was reportedly in the thick of the fighting, huge and terrifying, roaring and cutting down enemies. Tostig fought right beside him. But Harold's men were running on the energy of absolute urgency. They had just marched 200 miles to save their kingdom. They outnumbered the Vikings, who had been caught without their armor. The battle was brutal and bloody. But the English had the advantages of surprise, numbers, and the sheer desperation of men fighting for survival. Hardrada was killed. Reports say he was struck by an arrow in the throat. Tostig, Harold's traitorous brother, was killed alongside him. The Norwegian army, leaderless and broken, collapsed into chaos. The fleet of 300 ships that had arrived in England sailed home, with only 24 ships carrying the survivors. Let that number land for a moment. 300 ships came. 24 left. Harold had won one of the most complete military victories in English history. He celebrated in York. He was, for a moment, magnificent. 3 days later, a rider arrived with urgent news from the south. William of Normandy had landed. The wind had finally shifted on the night of the 27th of September, 1066. It was now blowing from the south, perfect for crossing the English Channel from Normandy to England. William gave the order immediately. His enormous fleet set sail through the night. Hundreds of ships, loaded with thousands of men, horses, weapons, supplies, and those prefabricated wooden castle sections. The crossing of the English Channel in the dark, with that many ships, carrying that much cargo, was a genuinely remarkable achievement of planning and seamanship. William's army landed at Pevensey Bay in Sussex on the morning of the 28th of September, 1066. There was essentially no resistance. The English forces that should have been watching the coast were already largely disbanded. Harold had stood down his southern defenses just days before, because William's winds had not cooperated and the army could not be kept in the field any longer. William came ashore. There's a famous story about him tripping and falling face first into the sand as he stepped off the boat. His men went silent. A fall like that was a bad omen. But William was quick. He grabbed 2 fistfuls of English sand and shouted that he had seized England with both hands. Whether it actually happened or whether someone invented it later to make William look clever under pressure, it is the kind of story that perfectly captures his personality, turning a potential disaster into a moment of power. William immediately began building fortifications. A castle went up at Pevensey. He then moved along the coast to Hastings, where another castle was built. His army spread out to a surrounding area, gathering food, livestock, and supplies, and burning what they did not take. Villages were destroyed. Farms were ruined. This was both a practical military necessity and a deliberate provocation. William wanted Harold to hear that his own lands, his own family's historic territory in Wessex, were being burned to the ground. He wanted Harold angry. He wanted Harold coming south fast, without proper rest, without proper preparation. It worked. Harold received the news of William's landing while he was still in York, still warm for his victory at Stamford Bridge. And he faced, right then, a decision that would define his place in history and would shape the lives of billions of people who had not yet been born. His army had just fought a major battle. They had marched 200 miles before that. Men were tired. Men were injured. His force of housecarls was diminished. Some had been killed at Stamford Bridge, others wounded and unable to fight at full strength. The FYRD men who had been sent home weeks earlier would need to be called back up, and they were scattered all across the country. The smart, cautious, strategically correct move was to wait, to pull back to London, to give his men time to rest and recover, to call the FYRD back and let them reassemble, to wait for winter, because armies in the 11th century struggled to keep fighting in winter, and William would have serious trouble keeping his forces fed on English soil for months if he did not win quickly. Time was actually on Harold's side, if he could bring himself to use it. His brother Gyrth argued exactly this. Gyrth told Harold, "Stay here, send me south, let me face William instead. If I lose, you can still fight. If you go and you lose, it is all over." Harold refused. Historians still argue about why. Perhaps it was anger. William was burning Harold's own family lands in Sussex, lands Harold had grown up on and cared deeply about. Perhaps it was overconfidence from the stunning, complete victory at Stamford Bridge. Perhaps Harold genuinely believed that speed was more important than preparation, that if William was allowed to sit and grow stronger through the whole winter, he would be even harder to remove in the spring. Perhaps Harold simply could not bear to send his brother to fight a battle that was his to fight. Whatever the reason, Harold turned south. He marched his army from York to London in roughly 4 days. Again, an extraordinary pace. He spent about 5 days in London, collecting additional troops, fresh housecarls, some in FYRD, some local forces from the surrounding area, and then he pushed south toward the coast. He was not at full strength. He was not properly rested. He was moving too fast. But he was moving. He arrived in the area near Hastings on the evening of the 13th of October. He set up his army on a long ridge of high ground, in a position that would become known to history simply as battle, because what happened there the following morning would be, without any question, the most important battle ever fought on English soil. The night of the 13th of October, 1066, passed very differently in the two camps facing each other across the darkened Sussex countryside. In the Norman camp, the mood was reportedly serious and disciplined. Priests heard confessions. Men prayed. They prepared their weapons and made their peace with God. William himself reportedly spent much of the night in prayer. The Norman army was well-rested, well-fed, and confident. They had been sitting on English soil for about 2 weeks, eating local supplies, keeping in one place, resting, and strengthening. William had done almost everything right in the preparation. In the English camp, the picture is more complicated and, honestly, more human. Some sources, admittedly Norman sources that may have been biased, say the English soldiers were drinking, talking loudly, and singing through the night. Whether this is accurate or just propaganda designed to make the English look undisciplined, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Harold arranged his army carefully on the ridge. Harold chose his ground brilliantly. Senlac Hill or Senlac Ridge gave the English a real and significant defensive advantage. The ground fell away steeply in front of them, meaning the Normans would have to advance uphill to attack. On both flanks, the terrain was difficult, marshes and soggy ground on one side, steep and wooded slopes on the other. The Normans could not easily go around. They would have to come straight at the English line. Harold arranged his forces in the famous Anglo-Saxon shield wall. At the very front were the housecarls, the professional soldiers, Harold's elite fighting force. These men had trained to fight from early in their lives. They carried long kite-shaped shields, swords, spears, and the fearsome Dane axe, a massive double-headed battle axe on a long handle that could cut clean through chainmail armor, and helmets with a single powerful swing. Behind the housecarls were the FYRD, the part-time citizen soldiers, armed with what they had, which ranged from hunting spears and knives to farm tools for the least equipped men. Harold himself positioned his personal standards, the Dragon of Wessex, and his own fighting man banner at the center of the line, on the highest point of the ridge. The shield wall, when it worked properly, was one of the most effective defensive formations in the entire medieval world. Men locked their shields together edge to edge, creating a solid wall of wood and iron. Spear points projected forward between the shields. Axes rose and fell in powerful arcs. Cavalry horses, which are intelligent animals, would not willingly crash into a solid wall of shields and screaming men. Harold had somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 men on that ridge. William had a similar number, possibly somewhat more, and crucially, William had something Harold did not have in anywhere near the same numbers. Cavalry, knights on horseback. and a far larger force of archers. The morning of Saturday, the 14th of October, 1066. William's army began to move sometime around 9 in the morning. The autumn sun was already up over the English countryside, and the air had the crisp chill of an October day in Sussex. On the ridge above them, Harold's shield wall stood silent, waiting, shields touching, axes ready, men staring down the slope. William organized his advance into 3 main groups. On the left flank, the Bretons, soldiers from the region of Brittany in western France. In the center, William's own Normans, his best men, the core of his force. On the right flank, soldiers from France and other allied regions who had joined the expedition for land and glory. The attack began with archers. Men with bows moved forward in front of the main army and fired up at the English line, hoping to thin out the shield wall and cause casualties before the main assault. But there was an immediate and frustrating problem. The English were uphill, and their shields were large and strong. The arrows mostly smacked into shields or sailed harmlessly over the heads of the men on the ridge. And because the English had very few archers of their own to fire back, the Norman archers could not recover arrows. They were burning through their supply quickly. The opening volley achieved relatively little. The archers pulled back. The infantry advanced. Thousands of men on foot, carrying spears, swords, and shields, began climbing up the slope toward the English line. Above them, the shield wall waited, absolutely still, and then the 2 sides crashed together. What followed was violent beyond anything most of us today can properly picture. The English shield wall did exactly what it was designed to do. It held. The housecarls at the front swung their Dane axes in massive, powerful strokes. Shields were split. Helmets were crushed. Men fell screaming. The Norman infantry attack slowed, staggered, pushed against that wall of wood and ire and human will, and could not break through. Then William sent in his cavalry. Armored knights on horseback charged up the slope. The thunder of hooves on the dry October turf. The crashing of lance on shield. The screaming of horses and men. It must have been genuinely terrifying even for experienced soldiers. But the shield wall held again. Horses are not suicidal. They will not willingly smash into a solid mass of shields and men with axes. The cavalry could probe at the edges, could strike at any gaps that opened, but could not punch through the locked shields. For a period that morning, it genuinely looked like Harold might win this. The shield wall was doing its job. William's assaults were being thrown back. The English position on the ridge remained strong. And then, on the Norman left, everything began to shift. The Bretons began to retreat. Not just pull back in good order, but actually break and run. In the chaos of the retreat, a terrible rumor swept through the Norman army. William was dead. The Duke had fallen. And when soldiers believe their leader is dead, panic is just one heartbeat away from total collapse. The Norman line started to come apart. And then Harold's men made the mistake that lost England. On the English right, the part of the line facing the retreating Bretons, portions of the FYRD broke ranks. They saw the Normans running away. They felt the rush of possible victory, the irresistible urge to chase, to finish it, to win. And they did something that the strictest military discipline in the world sometimes cannot prevent. They charged down the hill after the fleeing soldiers. Men screamed and ran down the slope, breaking the shield wall, leaving the high ground, abandoning the formation that had kept them safe all morning. And William, riding among his panicking men, pulling up his helmet to show his face, screaming that he was alive, that he was here, that they would fight, saw what had happened. He saw the English soldiers coming down the hill out of formation, exposed on the open slope below the ridge. He turned his cavalry around and charged. The English soldiers who had broken ranks and run downhill were caught in the open against mounted, armored knights. Without the shield wall, without the high ground, without the protection of organized formation, they were cut apart. It was a devastating disaster. Men who a moment ago had felt victory in their hands were dying in the open field. And William realized he could use this again. His commanders began to deliberately fake retreats, what soldiers call a feigned withdrawal. Norman troops would seem to break and run, drawing more English soldiers down off the ridge in pursuit. Then the cavalry would wheel around and destroy them in the open. This tactic requires real discipline and nerve from the men doing the retreating. They have to run convincingly enough to fool the enemy, then stop and turn on command while people are chasing them with weapons. William's men were experienced and skilled enough to do it. It worked more than once during that long October day. Each time it worked, more English soldiers died in the open, cut down away from protection of the shield wall. The ridge became emptier with every passing hour. The English line grew thinner. The gaps in the wall became harder to fill. The battle had been going for hours. The morning had become afternoon, and the afternoon sun was dropping lower. The English had been fighting continuously since the first assault, and they were tired and bleeding and dying, and there were no reinforcements coming from anywhere. What had started as a strong defensive position was slowly, steadily being bled dry. William ordered his archers to change their angle. Instead of firing flat at the front of the shield wall, they were to fire high, arcing their arrows up into the air, so that they would come down nearly vertical onto the men on the ridge. The shields the English carried were designed to block attacks from the front. They were far less effective against arrows coming straight down from above. The arrows rained down on the men behind the shields, men who could not raise their shields without opening gaps in the wall in front of them. The sky above Senlac Ridge rained iron, and somewhere in that rain of arrows and the chaos of dying men and splintering shields and screaming horses, and the last light of a terrible October afternoon, Harold Godwin's son was killed. The death of King Harold on the battlefield of Hastings is one of the most famous moments in English history, and also one of the most argued over. The image that most people know comes from the Bayeux Tapestry. The Bayeux Tapestry is a truly extraordinary artifact, a length of embroidered linen cloth approximately 70 meters long and 50 centimeters wide, stitched with colored wool thread, that tells the story of the Norman Conquest in a continuous sequence of images like a long, ancient comic strip. It was almost certainly made within a few decades of the battle, probably commissioned by Odo of Bayeux, who was William's half-brother and a bishop. There's a wonderful irony in the fact that it may actually have been stitched by English needleworkers, the conquered people making the story of their own conquest. In one panel of the tapestry, above the Latin words that translate as "King Harold is killed," there's a figure with an arrow apparently embedded in the area of his face or eye. Next to him is another figure being cut down by a Norman horseman. The traditional interpretation has been that Harold was hit by an arrow in the eye, a single shot from the Norman archer's high-angle volley that killed the King of England. This image has stuck in popular history for centuries. It is dramatic. It is specific. It has a certain brutal poetry about it. A king brought down not in a great sword duel, not in single combat with a worthy rival, but by a single arrow falling out of the October sky. But historians have questioned it seriously for a long time. The Bayeux Tapestry's images are not always completely clear, and later repairs and restitching over the centuries may have changed what we are actually seeing in that scene. Norman written accounts of Harold's death describe him being cut down by Norman knights who broke through the weakening English line and found him, hacked down with swords, some sources say badly mutilated. One account written about a generation after the battle describes Harold being struck in the head and killed, with no mention of any arrow at all. The honest truth is this: we do not know exactly how Harold died. The sources disagree, and the evidence is unclear. What we know with complete certainty is that he died, and the moment he fell, the moment Harold's banners, the Dragon of Wessex and the Fighting Man, went down into the churned and bloodied mud of Senlac Ridge, the English resistance died with him. When the men around Harold saw those banners fall, they knew the king was dead. And without a king, without a leader, the English army had nothing left to hold it together. The discipline that had maintained the shield wall for an entire day evaporated. Men began to run into the darkening evening. The Norman cavalry pursued them across the fields, cutting down those they caught. Some English nobles and housecarls made a last stand in a place the sources sometimes call the Malfosse, the evil ditch, where retreating English soldiers turned and fought once more in a final desperate effort. The Normans who charged into this last stand took serious casualties. But it was a final act of defiance, not a turning of the battle. The battle was completely and irreversibly over. England had a new master. William did not charge straight to London after Hastings. He was cautious, careful, and strategic, as always. He spent time consolidating his position on the coast. His men needed rest, and there were sick and wounded to deal with, and the logistics of supplying a large army had to be organized. Then he began moving, not in a straight line to London, but in a deliberate arc designed to cut London off and isolate it entirely. He took Dover, the key coastal fortress controlling the most important crossing point on the Channel. He fell ill for a time, possibly from a sickness that swept through his camp, but recovered and kept moving. He moved through Canterbury, the most important religious city in England. He circled south of London, cutting off the roads, burning the villages that supplied the city, and making one thing absolutely clear to anyone still considering resistance. Holding out against William was going to be very, very expensive. Inside London, the surviving English nobility was trying to organize. They named a new king, Edgar the Etheling, the closest surviving male relative of the old royal line. Edgar was young, probably in his mid-teens, and though he had the right blood, he had no army, no treasure of his own, and no real power behind him. The English nobles who backed him could not agree on a plan, could not coordinate, and could not find the will to keep fighting. As William tightened his grip around London, the resistance crumbled. One by one, the leading English nobles came to William and submitted. Edgar the Etheling submitted too. The brief would-be king gave up his claim without a single battle. On Christmas Day, the 25th of December, 1066, William of Normandy was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony itself turned into chaos. When the assembled crowd inside the abbey gave a traditional shout of approval for the new king, the Norman soldiers stationed outside heard the roar and panicked. Thinking it was an attack or a riot inside, they started setting fire to buildings. People inside the abbey rushed out to see what was happening. Pandemonium erupted all around the church. And inside the abbey, William finished his coronation trembling, not from fear, probably, but from the sheer weight of what was happening. The man who had crossed the Channel in an invasion fleet less than 3 months ago, who had fought the Battle of Hastings just 10 weeks before, was now, officially, King of England, William the Conqueror, King of England, and England would never be the same again. This is where the story of 1066 becomes truly mind-bending, because taking the throne was just the beginning. What William and the Normans in the years after the conquest reshaped England so completely, so deeply, and so permanently that you're still living inside those changes right now. Today, the language that changed everything. Start with the most surprising one. After the Norman Conquest, England had two languages operating at the same time, side by side, for roughly 300 years. The ruling class, the king, the barons, the bishops, the senior clergy, the educated elite, spoke Norman French. If you were important, if you were powerful, if you held any significant position, you spoke French. That was the language of the court, the language of law, the language of official business and high culture. The ordinary English people, the farmers, the craftsmen, the workers, the overwhelming majority of the population, still spoke Old English, the Anglo-Saxon language they had always spoken. For about 3 centuries, these two languages lived together in one country. And over those 3 centuries, something extraordinary happened. They began to blend. Slowly, word by word, phrase by phrase, generation by generation, they mixed and merged into something new, what we call Middle English. And from Middle English, over more centuries of change and growth, came the English spoken by Shakespeare. And from that, the English you and I speak right now. This is why modern English has that fascinating quirk, where we so often have 2 words for the same thing, one plain and simple from Old English, and one more formal and elaborate from Norman French. The animal in the field is a cow, Old English. The meal on the plate is beef, from a French word boeuf. The animal is a pig, Old English. The meat is pork, from a French word pork. The animal is a sheep, Old English. The meat is mutton, from the French word mouton. The animal is a deer, Old English. The meat is venison, from a French word venison. The pattern is remarkably consistent across these food words. The English-speaking peasants looked after the animals. The French-speaking Norman lords ate them. The division of labor is literally written into the language, and it goes much further than food. Help is Old English. Aid is from French. Begin is Old English. Commence is from French. Holy is Old English. Sacred is from French. Kingly is Old English. Royal is from French. House is Old English. Mansion is from French. Work is Old English. Labor is from French. Ask is Old English. Inquire is from French. Words having to do with government, justice, law, religion, cooking, art, fashion, and architecture. Most of these came from French. Words having to do with farming, home life, body parts, natural things, and basic everyday actions. These are mostly from Old English. Historians estimate that around 10,000 French words entered the English language after the Norman Conquest. Think about how many words you use every single day that came originally from French. Justice, government, parliament, court, prison, judge, jury, beauty, fashion, marriage, castle, army, war, peace, nation, country, color, royal, noble, mansion, palace, restaurant, menu. Every single one of these is a French word in your mouth because of what happened at the Battle of Hastings. And here is one more layer of craziness for you. The Normans themselves were originally Vikings. The word Norman comes from Northmen, men from the north. About 150 years before 1066, a Viking leader named Rollo had been given the land of Normandy by the French king in exchange for stopping his raids on northern France. Rollo's people settled there, stopped speaking Norse, adopted French, married French women, built French-style churches, and within a few generations had become, to all appearances, thoroughly French. So when the Normans invaded England, they brought with them a language that was itself the product of Vikings mixing with French people. History is full of these wonderful, dizzying circles. One of the biggest and most immediate changes William made was to who owned the land, because in the medieval world, land was everything. Land meant wealth. Land meant power. Land meant soldiers. Land was the whole game. In Anglo-Saxon England, land ownership was a complicated, organic thing that had grown up over centuries. Many different people owned different pieces of land in different ways, with different rights and obligations attached to each piece. It was messy and varied from region to region. William swept all of it away. He declared that all land in England belonged to him, every single acre, every field, every forest, every river and its banks. He was the ultimate owner of the entire kingdom. Everything else was just permission granted by the king, and that permission could always be taken back. Then he distributed the land again, but on his own terms, as part of a rigid and organized system. He kept about a fifth of the land for himself as royal estates. He gave a large portion to the church, partly genuine piety, partly very smart politics, since the church was a powerful institution whose support he needed. And the rest he distributed to his barons, the great Norman lords who had crossed the channel and fought with him, as what were called fiefs. A fief was a piece of land held from the king in exchange for a solemn promise of military service. When the king went to war, the baron was required to provide a specific number of armed knights. Below the barons were the knights, soldiers who received smaller pieces of land from the barons in exchange for the same kind of military service. And at the very bottom were the peasants, who worked the land and owed labor and regular payment to the lord above them. This pyramid of land and loyalty and military service is called feudalism. William did not invent it. It already existed in various forms in Normandy and France, but he applied it to England with a completeness and consistency that was remarkable. He used it as the fundamental tool to control his kingdom. He was also deliberately smart about how he distributed the land. No single baron received a massive, unified block of territory all in one place that could easily be defended as an independent power base. Instead, William scattered each baron's estates across several different counties. A baron might hold land in 5 or 6 very different parts of England, far apart from each other. This made it extremely difficult for any baron to sit in one secure location, build up his local strength, and start thinking about challenging the king. But the most dramatic change of all was simply who owned the land. Before 1066, England's major landowners were English, the Anglo-Saxon nobility, the earls, the senior nobles called thanes. After the conquest, William stripped land from the Anglo-Saxon elite, from those who had fought against him at Hastings, and from many who had not, and transferred it to his Norman supporters. By the time the Domesday Book was compiled in 1086, roughly 20 years after the conquest, only about 8% of the land in England was still held by English people. The remaining 92% was in Norman hands. Let that settle in for a moment. 92%. The entire ruling class of England had been replaced. The wealth, the land, and the power of the country had been taken from one group of people and handed to another. In human terms, this was a takeover of absolutely staggering scale. England had been conquered not just militarily, but economically and socially, down to its very foundation. The Normans brought to England a type of building that the Anglo-Saxons had never really developed to the same degree: the castle. Private, fortified structures owned by individual lords, designed both as a home and as a military base from which to control the surrounding area. The English before the conquest had fortified towns and earthwork defenses, but they did not have the Norman-style private castle as a fundamental tool of military and political control. William built castles everywhere he went. His barons built castles on their new lands, and England was covered with them faster than anyone could have imagined. The first castles built after the conquest were constructed very fast using the motte and bailey design. A motte, a raised mound of earth, sometimes naturally occurring, sometimes built up artificially to considerable height. A wooden tower built on top of the motte, the main defensive position, high enough to overlook the surrounding land. A bailey, a courtyard at the base of the motte, enclosed by a wooden fence, where animals, supplies, and soldiers were kept. The whole structure surrounded by a ditch or moat. These could be built in a matter of days. They gave a small Norman garrison a defensible position from which they could watch over and control a very large area of land. They were the visible, unavoidable symbol of Norman power planted in the English landscape. Over time, the wooden structures were replaced with stone, bigger, more solid, more impressive, more permanent. If you were an English peasant the years after 1066, there was almost certainly a Norman castle visible somewhere near your village. A constant, enormous, unavoidable reminder of who was in charge now and what the consequences of resistance would be. The Tower of London is the most famous castle from this period. William began construction of the Great Central Tower, what would become known as the White Tower, shortly after the conquest. It was designed as a royal residence, a treasury, and a fortress to keep the enormous and potentially rebellious city of London firmly under Norman control. That tower still stands today, nearly 1,000 years later. Dozens of England's most famous medieval castles, Windsor Castle, Warwick Castle, Lincoln Castle, Colchester Castle, Rochester Castle, trace their origins directly to the years immediately following the Norman conquest. The church in England before the conquest had its own distinct character, its own traditions, its own deeply rooted hierarchy of archbishops, bishops, and abbots who had grown up entirely within the Anglo-Saxon world. William changed this systematically and deliberately. He replaced Anglo-Saxon churchmen with Normans at virtually every important level of the institution. The most significant appointment was Lanfranc, an Italian-born scholar and theologian who became a major figure in the Norman Church. William made Lanfranc Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest church position in all of England, in 1070. Lanfranc then set about reforming the English Church, bringing it into closer alignment with Norman and continental European religious practices. William had papal support for his conquest, and part of the implicit agreement behind that support was that England's church would be reformed, that it would comply more closely with Rome, and that Norman-style church organization would be established. The Normans were also extraordinary builders of churches and cathedrals. They brought with them the Romanesque style of architecture, buildings that were big, solid, heavy, and powerful with massive thick walls, enormous round arches, and huge cylindrical columns. This style in England is simply called Norman architecture. Churches built in this way went up all over the country with breathtaking speed. Durham Cathedral is the great example. Construction began in 1093 on a dramatic cliff above the river where in northern England. It is considered one of the great buildings of the entire medieval world, and it is still standing today, still being visited by people from every country on earth. Those massive round arches, those enormous stone pillars, that sense of solid and overwhelming permanence. This is Norman architecture at its most powerful. It was built to last 1,000 years. It was built to impress and to overwhelm. It was built to say, "We are here, we have power, and we are not going anywhere." In 1085, 19 years after the conquest, William did something that no ruler in Europe had done before, and that no English ruler would repeat for centuries. He ordered a complete survey of his entire kingdom, not just a list of his own royal estates, not just a simple tax record, a complete, comprehensive, and detailed accounting of everything in England, every manor, every village, every piece of cultivated land, who held it now, who had held it before the conquest, how many people lived there, how many free men, how many peasants tied to the land, how many animals grazed the fields, how much the land was worth in the present day, and how much it had been worth in the time of Edward the Confessor. Teams of royal commissioners, men working directly for the king, traveled to every single county of England through 1086. They held local meetings. They summoned juries of local people to testify under oath about the land and its ownership. They asked the same standardized list of questions in every place they went and recorded all the answers with painstaking care. All of this information was then gathered, checked, and compiled. The result was called the Domesday Book. The name comes from an old word for judgment, like the final judgment of God on the day of doom. It was called this because the book's decisions were final and completely unchallengeable. If your claim to a piece of land was disputed, the Domesday Book's record was a final word. There was no arguing with it, no appealing against it, like the day of judgment in the Christian faith. Its verdict was absolute, and you could not escape it. It is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of any country in the world. No other medieval ruler in Europe did anything remotely like it. It gave William, and gives us nearly 1,000 years later, an extraordinary and detailed picture of exactly what England looked like in the late 11th century. And what it showed, among many other things, was just how complete the Norman takeover had been. In the decades since 1066, England's landowning class had been essentially entirely replaced. The Anglo-Saxon elite was gone. In its place was a Norman elite, speaking French, living in castles, holding land by grant from the king, and ruling England with an iron confidence that came from knowing they had conquered it. The conquest did not go smoothly everywhere, and we should be honest about that. English resistance was real, serious, and in some places deeply sustained. In 1068 and 1069, major uprisings broke out in the north of England. At one dramatic point, Danish Viking forces actually sailed in and temporarily occupied York, joining forces with English rebels. The entire north of England seemed to be slipping out of William's grip. It was a genuine crisis. William's response became one of the darkest and most horrifying episodes in all of English history. The harrying of the North, as it became known, was not ordinary wartime destruction. It was deliberate, systematic, and breathtaking in its cruelty. In the winter of 1069 to 1070, William sent his armies through Northumbria with orders to destroy everything. Farms were burned to the ground. Animals were slaughtered or driven off into the hills. Grain stores and food supplies were deliberately destroyed, not just eaten but burned, wasted, made useless. Farm tools were broken. Plows were destroyed. Villages that had stood for generations were leveled and left as ash. This was a deliberate and calculated policy of making the land completely unable to support human life. William intended to break the north of England so thoroughly, so permanently, that no rebel army could ever again find food, shelter, or any kind of support there. The result was catastrophic for the ordinary people who had nothing to do with the rebellion. A terrible famine followed through 1070 and into 1071. Tens of thousands of people died from the direct violence of the Norman armies moving through the land, and from the slow agony of starvation that followed when the food was gone and there was nothing left to plant or harvest. Some estimates put the death toll at 100,000 people or more. Villages that had existed for centuries were simply emptied of all life. The Domesday Book, compiled about 15 years later, still recorded enormous areas of northern England as simply waste, the official word meaning empty, abandoned, with no recorded population and no recorded value. Even people who supported William and admired his achievements were appalled by what happened in the north. Orderic Vitalis, a Norman English monk who wrote one of the most important historical accounts of the entire period, said with real distress that William had committed a terrible wrong, that he had deliberately starved innocent men, women, and children who had played no part in the rebellion, and that God would hold him accountable for it. This was not the language you normally use about the man who was your king and conqueror. It speaks to how bad things really were. It worked. The resistance in the north was broken completely. The last organized English resistance came from the fens, the marshy, waterlogged region of eastern England around what is now Cambridgeshire. A man named Hereward led a guerrilla resistance from the island of Ely, using the marshes and waterways that surrounded it to strike at Norman forces, and then disappear back into the swamp before they could be pinned down. Hereward became a genuine folk hero, a symbol of English pride and defiance, and his legend grew in the years and decades after the conquest. But William eventually found a route through the marshes. In 1071, Norman forces reached Ely. Organized English resistance was finished. More than 950 years have passed since that October morning on Senlac Ridge. The world has been transformed in ways that Harold Godwinson and William the Conqueror could not have imagined in their wildest moments. Electricity, railways, aviation, space travel, the internet. None of this existed in the world of 1066. They lived in a world of mud and swords and castle walls. And yet the Norman Conquest is still with you. Still in your language every time you open your mouth. Still in your laws, your institutions, your architecture, your very sense of what England is. The English language, now spoken by roughly 1.5 billion people on Earth as a first or second language, the language of international business, science, medicine, diplomacy, aviation, and the internet, is partly what it is because of the Norman Conquest. That mixture of direct, tough, honest Anglo-Saxon and flowing, complex Norman French created a language of extraordinary range and adaptability. A language that could say the same thing in a dozen different ways, with a dozen different shades of meaning. A language unusually open to absorbing words from other cultures, probably because it had already been through the experience of absorbing two very different languages into one. The English legal system, with its courts, judges, juries, attorneys, writs, and procedures, carries deep Norman fingerprints. The very words you encounter when anything legal happens in your life. Court, judge, jury, prison, attorney, justice, crime, verdict, sentence, guilty, innocent. Nearly all of these came from Norman French. The word parliament comes from a French word parlement, meaning a speaking, a discussion, the development of parliamentary government in England, which eventually gave the world one of the most influential models of democratic governance, has its very distant roots partly in the councils and courts of the Norman feudal system. The English aristocracy, with its titles of duke, earl, baron, and lord, bears the shape of Norman organization. Many of England's oldest noble families can trace their ancestry back to men who stepped off a ship at Pevensey Bay with William in September of 1066. And England's relationship with Europe, which shaped so much of subsequent history, was fundamentally altered by the conquest. Before 1066, England looked north and east toward Scandinavia and the Viking world. After 1066, England looked south toward France and continental Europe. English kings held land in France for generations. They married French royalty. They fought French wars. They were, for a very long time, as much French as they were English. Even the eventual separation of England from France, when English kings finally lost their French territories over the following 200 years, helped forge a stronger and more self-conscious English national identity. The English language reasserted itself. Great writers like Geoffrey Chaucer wrote extraordinary literature in English. The English began to think of themselves as specifically, deliberately, proudly English, not Norman, not French, but English. A new people, forged from the meeting of two worlds. Since we have followed William this far, you deserve to know how his story ended. He ruled England for about 20 years after the conquest, until 1087. He divided his time between England and his lands in Normandy, holding his kingdom together through a combination of military force, political skill, and a constant background threat of violence. He was not a king who was loved. He was a king who was obeyed, because not obeying him was extremely dangerous. He died in September of 1087, probably from an internal injury suffered when his horse stumbled at a burning town in France, and the front of the saddle drove hard into his abdomen. He was around 60 years old. Not young for a man of his era, a man who had spent his entire life fighting, riding, and living hard. His death was not dignified. The attendants who had been with him through the last days of his life, worried about their own estates and their own futures with the king dying, stripped the body of its valuables and rode off to protect their own interests. William's corpse was left lying on the floor of the church where he died. It was eventually taken to a monastery in Normandy called Saint Etienne for burial. But when the monks tried to lower the body into the stone tomb that had been prepared for it, it would not fit. William had been a large man, and the body had been in the summer heat for too long. The smell in the church was reportedly unbearable. The ceremony ended in confusion and disaster. It is almost impossible not to find something strangely human in that. The greatest conqueror in English history, the man who had been a whole kingdom to his will, ending not in triumph and glory but in chaos and indignity. History has no sentimentality about these things. Harold Godwinson's resting place is less certain. His body was recovered from Senlac Ridge after the battle. Some sources say he was buried with honor at Waltham Abbey in Essex, which he had personally cared for and supported during his life. Some say his burial place has never been definitively identified. He had been king for 9 months. He was gone in a single October afternoon. So here is where we land after everything we have been through together. One morning in October, over 950 years ago, two armies stood across a valley from each other in Sussex, England, and fought for the future of a country. Harold Godwinson, proud, brave, possibly too confident, definitely too fast, put a shield wall on a ridge and dared William to come at him. William, cold, calculating, brilliant, patient, came, and by the end of that day, England had a new king, a new ruling class, a new language forming, a new legal system taking shape, and a completely different future from the one it had been heading toward. No one standing on Senlac Hill that morning. Not Harold with his housecarls and their Dane axes. Not William with his knights and his archers. Not the men who ran, the men who died, and the men who fought to the last breath could have imagined that their fight would shape the lives of people speaking English on the other side of the earth nearly 1,000 years later. They were just men, fighting for their lives and for their king, fighting for what they believed was right and true. But history does not care about intentions. It cares about outcomes. And the outcome of the Battle of Hastings is literally written into your language every time you open your mouth to speak. Every time you say the word justice or castle or beef or parliament or court or royal or army, you're speaking a tiny fragment of October 14th, 1066. You are carrying a small piece of that battle in your mouth every single day. You are the inheritor of a language that was born from conflict, from a merging of two peoples and two tongues into something new and extraordinary. That is the Norman Conquest. That is 1066. That is why, of all the dates in all of English history, this one matters more than any other. Not just because a king died on a hill, not just because a duke became a conqueror, but because out of that violence and upheaval, a new England was born, and from that England, eventually came the language you are hearing right now. 1066, the year that made England, and in making England, helped make the modern world. If you want to keep going deeper into the history that shaped everything, click the video on your screen right now.